Armenia, 1988. 50,000 people died in a tragic earthquake. 10 years earlier in Iran, stone buildings collapsed in a familiar pattern, as they have for centuries in the Middle East, causing major devastation. All told, over 1 million people have died in earthquakes during this century alone, mostly from collapsed, poorly built structures. This is the equivalent of a major war. In our century, reporters have attempted to describe what they see of earthquakes and to capture images of the destruction. But what about earlier centuries? What did people say about these major earth convulsions? And what did they think they were? What can we learn from centuries of repeated earthquake activity? Earthquake disasters have been especially felt in the Holy Land, where active faults combined with stone construction have produced tragic results. This region is rich in archaeological sites that contain evidence of ancient earthquakes. Nowhere on Earth is the historical record longer, and nowhere can it be better seen than in the Holy Land. Professor Amos Nur has been traveling to the Holy Land for the past decade in an attempt to reconstruct the oldest record of earthquakes on Earth.
I've been teaching here at Stanford University for the last 20 years in geophysics and doing research about earthquakes and earthquake prediction. What you see here is my office right after the Loma Prieta earthquake last October. Here's my desk. I'm under the desk. The metal bookcases came off the wall, and the yellow journals you see are actually the journals of earthquake research. They cover the desk, they cover me, they almost killed me by this earthquake. Of course, since that earthquake, we mounted the bookcases back against the wall and bolted them in and put all the books back. But to be on the safe side, I removed my desk, which used to be here, as you saw in the picture before, and I decided to move it over to the other end of my office so that when the next earthquake happens, I don't get hit by my own earthquake prediction volumes. Although this university and its beautiful memorial church are only 100 years old, the Loma Prieta earthquake was not the first one to hit Stanford. The much bigger San Francisco earthquake caused enormous damage here in 1906, just a few years after Stanford was first built. Just like the 1906 shock, the Loma Prieta earthquake came as an utter surprise.
When the earthquake hit, the first thing that I thought about was get these kids out of here. The second thing was we'd always been told to put have people who are in the church go underneath the pews, the heavy oak pews. Fortunately, none of the students who were in here listened to me. They all bolted for the doors. And this was probably the best thing that could have happened, because huge pieces of mosaic came down from this Archangel Uriel that's over here and totally crashed through the heavy oak pews that were over here, where students had been sitting just seconds before.
One obvious question following the Loma Prieta earthquake is, when will be the next one? Now, an earthquake, let me show you here, happens when there is a sudden motion between two blocks along a fault. When that motion is large, we have a large earthquake. To predict an earthquake like this, we actually have to predict three things. We have to predict the location of a future earthquake, we have to predict the magnitude, and we have to be able to tell when it's going to happen. Now, fortunately, over the last century or so, We have learned a lot about the location of earthquakes, as you see in these colored belts. We also know a lot today about their magnitudes. What we have failed to do so far is predict their time. The best strategy for predicting the time of earthquakes is probably to look at their history and see if there is a pattern. Now, California has a lot of earthquakes. Unfortunately, California has no history. Recorded history in California is only about 150 years old. The Far East, China and Japan, have a lot of earthquakes and have fairly long recorded histories. Unfortunately, I don't speak Chinese or Japanese and therefore cannot do research here very well. The Middle East has earthquakes. It has very long recorded history. And because I come from here, it is most natural for me to go back and try to study the earthquake history of the Holy Land. It so happens that in 1927, a devastating earthquake occurred here near Jericho. That earthquake was recorded by modern seismic instruments all over the earth. It was reported on extensively by newspapers such as the New York Times. And we have a lot of photographic evidence for the devastation that what it caused in the Holy Land.
My husband was working in Egypt at the time, and he was coming up here for a holiday by train from Cairo to Jerusalem. And the train approached a station, and then when they got to the station, it wasn't there. There was nothing but a mass of ruins. And he said, "What's happened? What's happened? Where's the station?" And they said, "Well, there's been a terrible earthquake." That was the first he knew of it. They didn't hear about it in Egypt. And then he somehow got himself back to Jerusalem, on a camel, perhaps. If you like, I'll read you a passage from my mother-in-law's book. She was here at the time of the earthquake, and she recorded everything that she saw. Oh, dear. So this is part of her account of the earthquake as it affected Jerusalem. One of the queer jumps the course of the earthquake took was to deal gently with Bethany, whereas in Abu Dis, half a mile away, there was not a sound house left. Abu Dis depended upon rainwater cisterns for its water supply. Every cistern was cracked and the water drained out. My husband and I toured the damaged cities and villages. We found Abu Dis sadly in need of help. Dysentery and enteric fever were prevalent. Nearly everyone was suffering from sore eyes caused by the high wind, which raised dust from the crumbling houses. Water was non-existent and had to be carried for several miles from the Apostles' Fountain in a deep defile, where we as children had witnessed the fight between two opposing Bedouin parties. Dr. Bailey Willis, professor of geology at Stanford University, California, and famed as Earthquake Willis because he hunted earthquakes in every corner of the globe, had known Palestine was due for a quake and hastened to be in on the kill. He missed our quake by a few hours. He had reached Cairo when the tremors shook Palestine.
Below, you can see the roof, shattered in 1927 and now repaired, of this old Greek Orthodox monastery. The front wall of the monastery has by now been replaced. The towers were all rebuilt, and the central dome was reinforced with steel belts.
יש מקום אחד ליורד מהזלזל. מה זה זלזל? היה אדמה. כן. נזל כול. זלזל. כן, הכל יורד. בס מחר. מקום אחד. הנה הוא.
That's very. Shall I explain it in English?
זה לא ירד.
Okay, he said that this whole church has been destroyed probably several times by earthquakes, except this place, which has been always stand up.
This monastery and others around here were built here in the first place and rebuilt because they are next to the Jordan River, shown here on this beautiful satellite image. This is where John baptized early Christians. Unfortunately, the Jordan River runs right along this fault zone that begins in the Sea of Galilee and then runs south all the way into the Dead Sea. Then it picks up again on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, south here towards the Gulf of Eilat and the Red Sea. This fault, like the San Andreas, divides the motion between the Arabia Plate on the east to the north and the Israel-Mediterranean Plate on the west to the south. The 1927 Jericho earthquake, right here, fell smack on this fault. And so did many historical and biblical earthquakes. How can we tell? Well, we can tell from writings, and especially from archaeological excavations on sites that lie along this fault zone. We are going to take you on a tour of many of these sites in the rest of this movie. And we are going to start up on the northern end of Israel on the border with Syria with the Crusaders' fortification of Khalid Mehmood. This huge ruin of Khalid Mehmood, an old fortification used by Arabs and Crusaders, is situated on the main road from Galilee to Damascus. The destruction here was not by time or men, but by what must have been an awesome earthquake, which hit northern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, possibly in 1202 AD. What's left are collapsed towers, fractured walls, and huge stones scattered all around this fortification. I want to show you, around the corner here, one of the most unusual details of the destruction of Khalid Mehmood by this devastating earthquake. It's very amazing, in fact. It's incredible. I think what we see here is the vulnerable spot of this architecture, these keystones dropping down. In fact, when you look over here, what happened during the earthquake, this block shifted sideways. It opened up the arch and allowed the keystones to drop down. And you can see that if they dropped down another 10 centimeters, the whole structure would have collapsed and we wouldn't be able to stand here today and film this thing. Just like the individual keystones outside, the entire row of keystones in the roof of this hidden passageway slipped down during the earthquake. We can only begin to imagine how frightening this must have been to the Crusaders or Arab soldiers who were down here when this happened. This tremendous earthquake left in place only some of the huge stones we see now in the original wall. This wall was subsequently repaired with the much smaller stones in front of us. The earthquake also toppled this enormous corner of the fortification, which has remained tilted and twisted ever since. For the next 800 years, this place remained totally abandoned. Beit Shan is the site of one of the most astounding archaeological excavations in Israel today. What is being uncovered here is the evidence for the devastation by earthquakes of an entire city, this biblical, Roman, and Byzantine city of Beit Shan. We are flying now right over the excavated main street of the city. The stores, temples, and palaces uncovered here were left this way by a huge, ancient earthquake.
I try to make use as much as possible from the original material. So I use a kind of Roman mortar for the filling of the missing areas. Okay, you can also use Portland cement, but actually it's much too strong for the very fragile mosaics. And I think if the Romans used the lime mortar, and that keeps for 2,000 years, so why shouldn't I use the lime mortar?
Active restoration was ongoing when we arrived to film in Beit Shan, so we were fortunate to corner Professor Yoram Tzafrir, the chief archaeologist. According to Yoram, it was widely known before the excavation began that a major earthquake on January 18, 749 AD shook the entire Holy Land and also damaged Beit Shan. But no one realized until this excavation what devastation this earthquake caused here. From the new archaeological evidence, we now know that this earthquake completely destroyed Byzantine Beit Shan and transformed it from a magnificent metropolis into rubble in a few seconds. We are walking now along the main business street through the excavated ruins of a Byzantine city. Even though I have been here before, for the first time I can actually grasp the magnitude of this earthquake as I look at these huge, collapsed, broken limestone and marble columns. The thought struck me, walking here, that geologically and archaeologically speaking, this site of Beit Shan might be to earthquakes as Pompeii is to volcanoes. Here we see a row of collapsed arches which must have been part of an ancient Byzantine storefront or business building which fell flat into the street during the earthquake. The basalt block pavement under the arches is quite typical for important streets in Roman and Byzantine times. I'm walking here along a column that fell down during the 749 earthquake. The interesting feature is this base from which this column fell down. The column stood up here and topped over during the earthquake. And if you look down the row of bases here and the columns down there, you could easily imagine all these columns standing up here and falling over during the earthquake in a few seconds. We are looking here at the second most fascinating aspect of this excavation. What we see here are not Byzantine but Roman columns that did not fall this way during an earthquake but were placed here by a Byzantine builder when they rebuilt Beit Shan after some earlier disaster that happened here. We think that these columns fell down during the large earthquake of 363 AD, when Beit Shan was not a Byzantine, but a Roman city, and were used subsequently as a foundation of the new Byzantine wall. What we have here then is a double earthquake, one in 363 AD and a second one in 749 AD. It is that second earthquake which took Beit Shan out of history. I've just described to you how Beit Shan was removed from history, but I cannot help recall at this moment how it first appeared in history through one of the most poignant stories of the Old Testament, the story of King Saul's fatal battle against the Philistines at Mount Gilboa. as described in Samuel, Book 1, chapter 31.
Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and followed hard upon Saul, and slew Jonathan, and Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. And the battle went sore against Saul, and he was sore wounded of the archers. And Saul took a sword, and fell upon it. So Saul died, and all his men that same day together. And the Philistines fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. And the inhabitants of Yavesh-Gilad took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and buried them under a tree at Yavesh, and fasted 7 days.
There's another final point I must make here as we leave Beit-Shan. Besides the destruction of buildings, Yoram Tzafrir also described to us, in Hebrew, one of the most moving discoveries on this dig, the crushed skeleton under a collapsed column of a person reaching out to salvage a pile of coins a few inches away. We cannot see that skeleton, but the uncovered skeletons of a family in the excavated village of Qumran in Cyprus must convey an even greater sense of horror. David Soren from the University of Arizona and co-workers uncovered here a family, a man, a woman, and their baby, who were killed by their collapsing stone house during a large earthquake, probably on July 21, 365 AD, perhaps even the same earthquake which destroyed Roman Beit-Shan 350 kilometers to the southeast. Earthquake destruction was not limited to Beit-Shan, but affected also many other sites, villages, forts, and isolated houses in the surrounding areas. One site is the solitary mountaintop of Sartaba, where all we can see today are the stones covering the hillside, scattered there by an earthquake. Another site is east of the Sea of Galilee. We are now on the top of the hill of Susita, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias is across the lake. Capernaum is across the lake to the north of us. And the Dead Sea Transform, the plate boundary, runs right through the middle of the lake. What we have here are the remnants of a Roman palace, Roman temple, which was part of a winter resort, which was used by the Roman governor of Palestine. What we see here are granite columns, huge granite columns, in fact, that fell down during a historical earthquake. These granites were brought from overseas, from Sardinia or Upper Egypt, and hauled over the mountains to this isolated spot. The point of interest for our earthquake study is the direction in which this column fell during a historical earthquake. You see here the base of this column, the column itself, and the top overturned. A feature of great interest to us is also the line that connects the center of the fallen column with the center of the base, this line. We notice that it is not in the same direction as the column itself. This tells us that the column was kicked over during the earthquake and then fell in this direction. We use these facts to try to say something about the ground motion during this particular earthquake. We are now ready to go to the most important city in the Holy Land, Jerusalem. Through history, Jerusalem was devastated by numerous large earthquakes. but because of its economic and spiritual importance, it was never abandoned like Beit Shean. Instead, earthquake damage was repeatedly repaired and the city rebuilt. We have seen already the damage by the 1927 earthquake to the now rebuilt Augusta Victoria complex on Jerusalem's Mount of Olives. Of course, some of the most dramatic earthquake history in Jerusalem is found at the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, where Christ is said to be buried.
The Holy Sepulcher, I can tell you a little bit about the Holy Sepulcher because, the damage was very bad, and it's got these huge columns in the rotunda dating from Helena's time, and they were very badly damaged, and I was afraid the whole thing would collapse. And my uncle, who was out here in the Mandate days, he was Director of Antiquities, he shored up all those columns with concrete all round them and iron bands round to hold them up. And it remained like that, until sometime in the 60s, when they finally started repairing it, and they took all the concrete off. But it had scaffolding up it all. When I first knew it, it had scaffolding all over the front, which was sort of supporting it, and on the columns all encased in concrete. And they never could repair it because the 3 or 4 different churches who inhabit it couldn't agree whose job it was to repair it.
In fact, the entire neighborhood is all propped up with steel bands, scaffolding, and I-beams. Yet most people who walk and live here are oblivious to all the contained damage. They would probably be totally surprised if we told them that this was caused by an earthquake only 63 years ago. I think the most intriguing reference to an historical earthquake here is found in Matthew chapter 27.
Jesus yielded up his spirit, and behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints were raised. And after his resurrection, the centurion and those with him saw the earthquake. And they feared greatly, saying, "Truly, this was the Son of God."
Many walls of the old city of Jerusalem, like the one we see here, form a masonry quilt made up of irregular patches of different stone sizes and construction styles. Each patch is a different repair done following the collapse of a wall, mostly by earthquakes over the past 2,000 years or so. One of the most horrible of these earthquakes hit Jerusalem at 1 p.m. on January 14th, 1546 AD. An anonymous Jewish resident of Jerusalem at the time wrote,
"The new wall of the city collapsed from top to bottom, except for the Gate of Mercy, which survived. Not a house escaped damage by this earthquake, including mosques, churches, and synagogues, although I am proud to say that our synagogue was unharmed. The Dome of the Rock was very badly damaged, and the Dome of the Holy Sepulcher collapsed. Christian groups offered a large sum of money to gain permission to rebuild, but were refused by the Muslim government, who said, 'What has fallen should remain fallen.' The Jordan River, east of Jerusalem, dried up for 3 days by this earthquake because 2 big mountains fell into the river and dammed it up.
It was King Herod who erected the Temple Mount and its enormous platform, which we see here from the air. The Mosque of Omar, the Dome of the Rock, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre were built around this platform. This charismatic and brutal ruler of Judea was buried in 4 BC in his tomb on top of the imposing Mount of Herodion below us, east of Bethlehem. It was during Herod's reign in the year 31 BC, over 2,000 years ago, that one of the most devastating earthquakes hit the Holy Land. The most striking archaeological evidence is found in the excavated ruins of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. The Essenes, who lived here before and during Christ's time, made their living producing copies of the holy books. Because there are no springs here, they were entirely dependent on rainwater captured in the mountains and channeled into the numerous cisterns below. It is in one of these cisterns that we find evidence for this earthquake. So, Dubi, I think this is one of the most amazing earthquake archaeological evidence for earthquakes in the Holy Land. And I think most archaeologists agree that what you see here is the result of this earthquake at 31 BC, which offset these stairs going down the cistern. The beautiful aspect is we can actually tell the slip, because here's a wide step and here's the other wide step. It's a narrow one, slip of about 50 centimeters vertical. So, in my opinion, this is the oldest recorded rupture plain we have, historical rupture plain we have anywhere on Earth. So the most exciting thing is that this fracture, you see it, as fresh as you see it, all the way from up there down. And look at the wall here, it's fractured like a classic earthquake fracture, except that it's 2,000 years, happened 2,000 years ago. This is 2,000 years old. Unique written evidence for this earthquake is provided to us by the Jewish historian Josephus.
At this time it was that a fight happened at Actium between Octavius Caesar and Antony in the 7th year of the reign of Herod. And it was also that there was an earthquake in Judea, such a one that has not happened at any other time, and which brought a great destruction upon the cattle in the country. About 10,000 men also perished by the fall of houses. But the army, which lodged in the field, received no damage by this sad accident.
Da ist der Zimmer, was haben geschrieben, die Schriftrolle. Mit Zugabe, Asphalt von Totem Meer, was kommt raus und schwimmt doch. Von dem haben sie Tinte gemacht.
As a result of a 31 BC earthquake, Qumran was abandoned for a century or so. While we filmed here, many tourist groups visited Qumran, but none stopped by this ruptured cistern. This is a little bit like walking down Main Street, Beit-Shan today and not being told that an earthquake removed it from history. Some of the most intriguing evidence for ancient earthquakes is found in fallen walls, and no place is better for that than the solitary fortress of the rock of Masada or Metzada in the harsh Judean wilderness. At the end of a Jewish war against the Romans, around 70 AD, the stronghold of Metzada became the last free Jewish community in Judea. According to Josephus, 960 zealots, men, women, and children, lived on this awesome rock for 3 years, surrounded by the Roman army. Protected by the natural steep cliffs and the fortifications added by Herod at an earlier time, they managed to fend off the Roman legions for those 3 years. Insisting on victory, the Romans finally erected, with enormous effort, a 450-foot ramp on the western side of the rock to break into the fortification. A day before the Romans breached the final wall, the defenders committed mass suicide, each man killing his own family before being killed himself or taking his own life. The Roman soldiers marched in the next day to find the 960 bodies in the stillness of this mountaintop. However, unlike the destruction of its people, the physical destruction of Metzada came later, and not through the Roman army, but by an earthquake. These rows of stones we see here are the kind of evidence that we came to look for. These stones were part of a wall that existed here and which collapsed during an earthquake sometime after the 73 AD conquest of Metzedah by the Romans. This wall was part of an entire storeroom complex that collapsed, as you can see in this aerial photo, taken before the excavation of Metzedah. Some of the storerooms, in which the Metzedah defenders probably kept their food and arms, were subsequently restored. This is one of the storerooms that were excavated and rebuilt by the archaeologists. The black line you see here is the boundary between the part that was intact and the part that was rebuilt. I'm really impressed by the effort that the archaeological volunteers put into rebuilding this wall of the storeroom. And yet I can't help but worry about what will happen when the next big earthquake hits the Dead Sea Transform and this building is going to shake once more. This question of future earthquakes is the question of earthquake prediction. As we fly across the destroyed remains of Herods Palace, I must return to Josephus' writing about the 31 BC earthquake. Because this earthquake devastated Judea while the country was, as usual, at war, it tremendously demoralized the Jewish army, and it was up to Herod to lift their spirit in an astounding speech he made in Jerusalem right after the earthquake.
Do not be demoralized by the convulsions of inanimate nature, or imagine that the earthquake warns us of another disaster to follow. These elemental disturbances are subject to physical causes and do men no harm beyond their immediate damage. Pestilence, famine, and earthquake may possibly be foreshadowed by some slighter forewarning. But these catastrophes do not generally go beyond their natural limits, and their effects are instantaneous.
This is what Herod said 2,000 years ago, and this is also pretty much where earthquake prediction stands today. With this record of 2,000 years of earthquakes going back to 31 BC, I'm pretty sure that we captured all the big ones because they've all been observed or recorded by somebody. We can take these events and plot them back in time to see if there's a pattern. From the size of the earthquake damage zone, we can estimate the magnitude of each one of these historical earthquakes. As we look at the pattern of this longest recorded sequence of historical earthquakes on Earth, we recognize right away a very important, although very disappointing fact. The time interval between earthquakes is so irregular here that prediction based on history is practically useless. But the data raises another totally unexpected problem. We know the rates at which plates, which make up the surface of the Earth, move relative to one another across plate boundaries, shown here by these black dots which represent earthquakes. We know, therefore, that the Arabia Plate should have moved 14 meters during the past 2,000 years. That is, unless the fault here was partly stuck. I think the fault was in fact partly stuck, because if we take the slip of all our historical earthquakes and add it up, we get only 3 or 4 meters, not 14. So we have a big discrepancy. It would take 64 or so magnitude 6.8 earthquakes to get 14 meters of slip over 2,000 years. We had only a dozen or so. Or equivalently, it would take a single magnitude 8 or 8.2 earthquake to do the same. I think the reason for the discrepancy that we have here is that we didn't have a single magnitude 8 or 8.2 earthquake in our 2,000-year window. The question is, can we go back to the Middle East and look for that missing large earthquake sometime before 31 BC? Jericho, with its abundant springs, is an amazing oasis in the middle of a parched and hostile Judean desert. For 10 millennia, or 300 generations, life has gone on here almost unchanged. Many monasteries were built around Jericho, close to where baptism was first enacted in the nearby Jordan River. Some of these have been continuously occupied for almost 2,000 years. The gray and dusty mound below is the remains of Jericho, the oldest city on earth. It is believed by many to be the cradle of agriculture, and it is here that the primordial conflict between the nomad shepherd and the settled farmer was first acted out, as portrayed by Cain and Abel in the book of Genesis. Because of this conflict, it is here that we find the oldest walled and defensible settlement known to man. And it is here that Joshua led the Israelites from the desert into the lush and promised land. There is no better place to understand why the nomadic tribes, including the Israelites with Joshua in charge, wanted this place. They wandered and lived in this horrible desert over there. They looked and saw this beautiful oasis, and they simply wanted it. I'm standing here on top of one of the oldest layers of the city of Jericho, about 8,000 BC. That's about 10,000 years old. On top of this, there were something like 20 additional cities that were repeatedly destroyed, many of them probably by earthquakes. Some of the destruction is apparent in the wall that you see here that was excavated by several archaeological expeditions. You see layers of debris, collapse. The black layers indicate probably fires that happened here. And these collapsed layers piled up over the centuries. The most celebrated destruction of Jericho was when Joshua conquered it, for which we have a description in the Old Testament.
And it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat. So the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city.
We speculate today that Joshua's conquest of Jericho was made possible by an earthquake. Very important evidence supporting this speculation is found in Joshua chapter 4.
And as they that bare the ark were come unto Jordan, the waters which came down stood and rose up upon a heap. And those that came down toward the salt sea failed and were cut off. And the people passed over on dry ground until all the people were passed clean over Jordan.
We know from historical writings that the Jordan River has stopped flowing many times during past earthquakes. We also know today that this is caused by the plunge of the riverbanks into the Jordan during earthquakes. There is other evidence too. The ancient but extremely well-preserved grain in these jars was excavated here in Jericho. Modern carbon-14 dating has revealed an age of 1400 BC, amazingly close to Joshua's entry into the Promised Land. The question is, why didn't Joshua's army take this grain? Most likely, they couldn't, because it was trapped under the earthquake-collapsed wall of the city. "2,100 years and many earthquakes later, another earthquake destroyed the Hasan Palace, only half-mile away from the walls of Jericho. Obviously, the builders had no clue that this is earthquake country, and the people who lived here had long forgotten previous earthquakes. Even today, after 23 destroyed cities and 10 millennia of disasters, we still build here and elsewhere, as in Iran and Armenia, exactly as we did before, totally vulnerable to the devastation of the next earthquake. We are standing here east of Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives on our right, the Dead Sea and Jericho are down there. And we came here to quote from Zechariah chapter 14. "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, toward the east and towards the west. And there shall be a great valley. And half of a mountain shall remove towards the north, and half of it towards the south. And ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah." That is 756 BC. That earthquake destroyed parts of Jerusalem, Jericho, Beth-Shan, Hatzor, and other places, some of which we have seen already. The most remarkable thing about this quotation from Zechariah is the clear description of a strike-slip fault in which the part to the east moved to the north and the part to the west on which we stand now moved to the south. This is exactly the kind of motion that we know happens on the Dead Sea transform during earthquakes, and is also the motion that we know involves plate tectonics as we know it today.
This is a seismic station right on the top of Mount Sodom, which is a big dome made out of salt, and it's bounded by two major strands of the Dead Sea transform, one on the east side and one on the west side. This combination between the two strands makes this area very, very seismically active.
It is presumably around here, close to the Dead Sea, that the most famous biblical catastrophe took place.
The Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. And Abraham looked towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace.
The upheaval of a plain could have very well been an earthquake, and the smoke could have been the dust rising gradually from the dry shaken ground, so typical of earthquakes in dry country. We have gone as far back in time as we can go in our Odyssey. Scientifically, I believe that the large, missing, magnitude 8 earthquake could be the one during Uzziah's time in 756 BC. Only large observed ground distortions and fault slip on the order of meters could have enabled Zechariah to describe it so vividly and so much like the observed offset fence from the magnitude 8.2 San Francisco earthquake of 1906. But besides science, we have also discovered in our Odyssey an extraordinary human drama spanning 10 millennia and more. We have discovered the unending quest of men like Zechariah, Matthew, and Herod to comprehend the meaning of these enormous and punishing earth convulsions. Nothing surpasses the poetry of the Bible in Kings, Book 1, Chapter 19, when the prophet Elijah, wishing to die, escaped to the desert and stood before the cave at Mount Horeb. And the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire a still small voice. Personally, I must agree with Herod's view of earthquakes as inanimate natural upheavals. We know now only too well how cruel and how unfair these natural upheavals are. And we have learned from their history and some of the oldest records on Earth that whether we are prepared or not, earthquakes will relentlessly happen again and again and will remain totally indifferent to our unpreparedness and totally indifferent also to our innocence. We cannot prevent earthquakes. We now know we cannot yet predict them. And we cannot easily abandon where we live to move away from them. There remains only one thing we can do about earthquakes. We can build better. Because, as we have seen so dramatically and so brutally, it is not earthquakes that kill people. Buildings do.